Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat? It appears as though Dennis Allen's going to keep his job. A lot of people have asked, is Pete Carmichael going to be retained? Don't know. Dennis Allen said he didn't know as of this point, and I believe him. I think there's time to evaluate all that stuff, but you get the combine coming up next month, so you need your staff really settled by then. New coaches need to be in place. So, look, the playoffs are starting right now. It's entirely possible that someone the Saints might want to talk to is coaching in the playoffs. If that's the case, you'd have to wait until that team was eliminated. So, I'm not saying that because they haven't made an announcement yet, nothing's coming. It could. I mean, you were a team that averaged 19 points a game this year. You were really bad on offense. There is no tap dancing around it. Your offense was anemic this year, and Andy Dalton is a big part of it. He's not a good quarterback anymore. He is a guy that is a veteran player who's played a lot of games. He can get you in and out of the huddle. He can manage an offense, but you are never going to be dynamic with him under center. Dalton last year signed a 1-year, $3 million contract with New Orleans. So he's a free agent after this season. We know Jameis Winston is not going to be retained. They have him under contract for another year, but when you look at Jameis Winston's contract, it's just very evident that they are not going to pay him the $15 million that would be required for him to be on the roster next year. So Jameis Winston's not going to be back, and Andy Dalton's a free agent. So the question you have if you're New Orleans is, do you ride with Andy Dalton for another year, or do you seek another free agent quarterback? Now, we'll run through this list of free agents that are out there, and we'll kind of talk about, what options are there, what options are realistic. At the top of the list is Tom Brady, who's a free agent after this year in Tampa. But if Tom Brady plays another year, he's going to play another year where he can win a Super Bowl. And that's not going to happen in New Orleans. Unless if the weird one-off scenario unfolds where Sean Payton comes back to New Orleans with Tom Brady, which I don't think any of us think that that's really going to happen. Okay? So you can really just scratch Tom Brady off the list. The other guys on the list that are kind of interesting, Baker Mayfield, who's been a starter, Sam Darnold, who spent this year in Carolina as a free agent, Jimmy Garoppolo, who is 31 years old. I mean, he's about the same age now as Teddy. That's a year older than Teddy Bridgewater. I mean, he's been around the league long enough to where you go, all right, how many more good years does Jimmy G have, and what do his really elite years even look like? We'll come back to Jimmy G. Teddy Bridgewater, Daniel Jones, who at this point, considering they're in the playoffs, it's hard to imagine the Giants not making a run to keep Daniel Jones there in New York. And there's just a whole lot of blah, man. It's Case Keenum, it's Mason Rudolph, it's Jacoby Brissett, Geno Smith at 32 years old, but he's likely back in Seattle. We mentioned Andy Dalton. Mike White, I think the Jets would be silly not to bring him back as well as he played when he was the starter there. He's a better option right now than Zach Wilson is. A lot of people have brought up Taylor Heineke, who I think he'll be back in Washington. And there's Lamar Jackson, who, if they don't get a deal done with him in Baltimore, they're going to franchise tag him. So that's really your list. I could also throw out a name like Gardner Minshew, who's a former 6th-round pick, and by the Jags in 2019, and started for the Jags, and obviously started a couple games in Philly this year. We saw him play a good game against Dallas, and then play a really bad game against New Orleans. But if you are the Saints, your question really comes down to, if you're gonna bring in a good quarterback, you're gonna have to pay for it. So are any of those players worth giving up an asset to trade for them, to trade for a player, or what it would cost you to sign a player, right? So you could do By the way, I don't know that there are any quarterbacks in the NFL that are going to be tradable. What I mean is, you're not going to trade another team for a starting quarterback in the NFL. That it just doesn't happen. If you have an elite starting quarterback in the NFL, you hold on to him. There are rare occurrences where teams decide to move on from a player who can still be very good. Drew Brees is maybe the best example of that. We could look at a guy like Kirk Cousins, who Washington just kept franchise tagging because they didn't want to make the long-term commitment. Ultimately, he walks to Minnesota, and you can make your own decisions about what he's been there. He's thrown for a lot of yards, but they haven't won at an elite level with Kirk Cousins there. And I don't know that you look at Baker Mayfield or Sam Darnold or Jimmy G or Teddy Bridgewater as that guy. Like, Spotrac calculates market value for quarterbacks. Like, for example, Jimmy Garoppolo, they estimate his market value at $34.9 million per year. If you're the New Orleans Saints and you say, okay, Jimmy Garoppolo is a better option than Andy Dalton or Jameis Winston or anything else we have, and they're showing a 4-year contract is what the market would command. 4 years, $139 million. I don't know how, if you're New Orleans with your cap situation, you can justify a $140 million contract for Jimmy Garoppolo, who, yes, he got San Francisco to a Super Bowl. He's also been an anemic quarterback. He's sort of an enigma because, yes, he got San Francisco to a Super Bowl, but it's fair to say how much of San Francisco getting to a Super Bowl was because of Jimmy Garoppolo and how much of it was because they have arguably the best roster in the NFL, and he just needed to not screw it up. And that's kind of what he's been. And he's certainly not a quarterback that I tell you is worth shelling out $35 million per year for. So for me, with the Saints, I mean, yes, I think this year you have got to have some type of veteran quarterback, on the books. Maybe it's a player like we mentioned, Baker Mayfield or Sam Darnold, effectively what you did with Jameis and Andy Dalton. Maybe it's bringing back Andy Dalton on another 1-year deal. I don't believe the market's going to be robust for Andy Dalton. You could certainly look at a situation in Green Bay and say, okay, well, what happens there with Jordan Love? Does Aaron Rodgers return to Green Bay? If he does, could you do a deal for Jordan Love? Then if you're the Saints, you have to ask yourself, okay, what are we realistically willing to give up for a guy that was a first-round pick but hasn't played? I mean, in his career, Jordan Love made one start. It was last year when Rodgers tested positive for COVID. And he threw for 190 yards, a touchdown, and a pick, and ran for 23 yards. I mean, that's it. What are you willing to give up for Jordan Love? Not anything of significance. Why wouldn't you just in turn draft your own version of Jordan Love, whatever prospect you felt good about? I know a lot of people have brought up Derek Carr as a former second-round pick, but it goes back to the same exact thing with Derek Carr that we talked about. There's a really good chance, I guess, that the Raiders could cut Derek Carr. And if that's the case, if they do, you could sign him to whatever deal you want, whatever deal you see fit. But his current contract that he signed was a 3-year, $121 million contract with the Raiders. And, he's the way they've structured that thing, he's not an unrestricted free agent until after 2026. So the Raiders could have an out on the contract, but if you traded for him, you'd be looking at a $34 million cap hit in 2023, then a $43 million cap hit, then another $43 million hit. So, you wouldn't trade for that guy because not only are you trading an asset for the player, you're trading for the contract. There just isn't any way that would make sense for a team like New Orleans. You'd wait till he got cut, and then maybe you go win a bidding war. But again, what are you willing to pay? Ultimately, as I sit here today, I don't see a great option for New Orleans, an option that's better than drafting a player. So I know you can't necessarily just rely on the draft when you don't have a top 5 pick in a talent-heavy draft where you're going to get a really good player. I think if you're New Orleans, you have to go the route of draft a quarterback with the highest pick you have. If that's your first pick in round 2, or if you end up acquiring a first-rounder because of Sean Payton, and you could take a quarterback in round 1, you do it. And you have to take that risk. Eventually, you're going to have to take that leap. It's sort of astonishing that in their history, the Saints have only drafted a first-round quarterback once with Archie Manning. That's it. In the 50-plus year history of this franchise, 55 years, one time they've taken a quarterback in round one. Archie Manning, that's it. Eventually, you're going to have to pull that trigger, and you can't live in quarterback purgatory with all these mediocre players. So, and this has got to be the year to do it because the free agent market isn't going to be there. There isn't a trade-worthy quarterback out there, and even if there were, you don't have the assets to trade for. So, get yourself a safety net. If it's Andy Dalton or whatever version of Andy Dalton that is, Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, some guy who's played quarterback in the NFL but isn't ever going to be elite, and go try to draft your elite quarterback. There just isn't a better path in the world. Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact, and be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.